Hello, everyone. I'm David Chandross. I'm a professor of digital media, and I work in the Emergency Preparedness Lab at Toronto Metropolitan University. And we are giving a talk today on Thanksgiving, the real story behind Thanksgiving. Now, what we're going to see is that this is what we associate with Thanksgiving, this beautiful turkey and people gathered together. But that's not the way First Nations people see Thanksgiving. In many cases, it's not observed at all, or it could be seen in a negative way. So what we're going to try to deal today is let you see that this, like anything in the world, can be is a story of narratives, of stories, and we are human stories. And my story of Thanksgiving is different than yours, who is different than another. And if we can learn each other's stories, then we can connect with each other. And one example I always give is the Israelis and Palestinians. Israelis believe that they have one story about their country, and the Palestinians have a different story. And they both believe very much in their story, and they're both sincere, and they're both good-hearted peoples that have a truth. But their truth is based on a different interpretation and different story. So let's look at Thanksgiving as a model and try to understand this holiday and its history. So if we look at Thanksgiving, it's a national holiday in the United States. It was added by Canada, and as you know, it's coming up on Monday of this year, but it's really an American holiday. And for example, this year it will occur on Thursday, November 23rd. So in 1621, colonists from England and the native Wampanoag people shared a feast that is said to be the first Thanksgiving feast. Now, Thanksgiving actually comes from a tradition of being thankful to God that your crops weren't destroyed, that Christians celebrated all over Europe. So it has some deeper roots, but this would be the start of what we call Thanksgiving. And it's based on kind of a myth and kind of a truth, and you'll see where those differences lie. So this is the way you would probably pronounce it. This is the proper, but these are the Wampanoag people Wampanoag are Native American people of the northeastern woodlands. They were based in southeastern Massachusetts and parts of Rhode Island, and their territory included the island of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. The pictures I'm using are all Adobe stock licensable photos. They're not taken from any collections at Musqueam because we don't have express permission to share such images. So I'm using stock to move the story along. At the time of this first contact in the 17th century, this was a confederation of 24 recorded tribes. The population of these First Nations people were in the thousands. About 3,000 lived in Martha's Vineyard alone. From 615 to 1619, an epidemic killed off a lot of them, and there were maybe only 400 left in some areas. Like, it was massive. Now, this was leptospirosis, and for a while they felt smallpox certainly devastated a lot of First Nations people, but this leptospirosis wasn't a big player, and they thought it might have happened naturally, but now it appears that the French brought this to them and killed them off. So it's trying to understand the effect of colonization had already begun to lay its claws into the Massachusetts Bay colonies. So now 50 years later, actually, as you'll see in the plot, tensions get so strong between the First Nations people and the settlers that a war is started. And their chief, Sachem Medicom, and his allies waged what was called King Philip's War. And it lasted from 75 to 76, a war against the colonists. It resulted in death of 40% of the surviving tribal members. And the English then sold many of the men into slavery in Bermuda, the West Indies, or plantations in New England. So you need to understand, and most people don't, that indigenous people of North America, which we call First Nations here, were enslaved and sold as slaves. I don't think that is in any history I ever got in school. We knew about the genocidal actions of people well, we could go on with Americans, Jackson and others, Andrew Jackson, who gave a bounty for scalps. But this level of horror that you were battling and enslaving the people that invited you in, and we're going to see how nasty this story gets. So anyways, there is a battle of King Philip's War, and they are ultimately defeated. Now, in 1620, the High Chief Massasoit made a peace treaty with the Pilgrims who had landed in the tribe's territory. And until he was died, that treaty was accepted and respected by both parties. We'll talk about the Pilgrims and who they were And this is where narratives are important, because they were subjects to a church that was cruel, the Catholic Church, and they were Protestants, and some of them were from Irish background. The Irish were slaves of the British. So people were coming to this new land to escape persecution. And ain't it funny how they become the no persecutors? So stories are never simple, they're always complicated. So basically, as we've said, the settlers, as they began to build and encroach on tribal lands, they were treated very poorly because they followed what was called polygeneity, the white people at the time. Now, polygeneity is opposed to monogeneity. What it means is that according to evolution, at that time, the science was very bad. They felt that First Nations people, natives, were not human, and neither were Black people. They were like the Neanderthals or the earlier species of man, like cavemen, and that Homo sapiens, the species of the European white, was the top. Now, they also felt later on that the Chinese weren't human. So this is where some roots. So I don't know if colonization alone is the problem. It's colonization with a bestial idea. So their idea of subjugating First Nations people, it's like we would treat cattle. And that theme emerges all through early colonization. So keep that in mind. So Metacom, known to the English as King Philip. So as he said, he organized a confederacy to drive all the colonists out. The colonists had a lot of guns and a lot of technology. So they beat and they killed King Philip. They killed the other leading chiefs. They almost exterminated these people. And some survivors got into the interior. Some moved to Martha's Vineyard. There were some kin that had been neutral during the conflict, so they took them in. Disease and epidemics started killing the ones in Nantucket. And this is without alcohol. Let's not even talk about what alcohol did to fractionating. So we'll talk a little bit more about these narratives. We're going to shift around in narratives a little bit. We're going to move around to various versions of what happened. So for 2 centuries, individual colonies of states after that, from the 1600s on, is celebrated Thanksgiving. And then Abraham Lincoln was in the middle of the Civil War, and he said, we're going to have a Thanksgiving Day every November. So it was Lincoln that did it. As you know, Lincoln led a war against the Southern U.S. That believed in slavery, and Northern U.S. did not. I know it wasn't as simple as that. I know you go into biography, you could say Lincoln was a stinker too. But I mean, we were all people of our times. It's still legitimate to say that Lincoln was fighting for the emancipation of slavery. And many, many tens of thousands of Americans lost their lives in that war, which resulted ultimately in the abolition of slavery. This was the old territory that, and there's Plymouth right here. There's the first landing of the Mayflower. And now imagine you've landed here in North America and it's winter and you don't know what to do. You're relying on the First Nations people to survive. So this is vast. This is the Confederacy that was once held by these great people. They were semi-sedentary. They would move through New England. The men would go north or south looking for good seasonal fishing. The same true in Ontario, here in Canada. The Ojibwe, Anishinaabe would go north in the summers, and then it would come down south toward Toronto in the winters. So they had a summer and a winter. You know, you're going where the food is good, where you can get resources. It was good to be near a lake in the summer, right? Fantastic for eating. So they would stay for months at a time. There were permanent kind of long houses that developed in the Iroquois Confederacy, as well as these. The women cultivated the 3 sisters, which was corn, climbing beans, and squash. And then fish and game would be caught by the men. And there were really defined boundaries for hunting, because you had to respect that we had hunting boundaries so we could all live. Now, the actual story, now we sort of look and how they got here. It was in September 1620, and it was called the Mayflower, and that's a reconstruction of it. It's called the Mayflower II. It was built to specification, and that had 100 passengers, and these were religious separatists because they were trying to build a better world. So this is where it's important to understand narrative. They weren't horrible, creepy people saying, let's go and conquer a land. They were running because they were going to be thrown in jail and persecuted if they didn't get out. But then in turn, what they did to the First Nations was nasty, right? So Dumpin' is dumpin' on dumpin'. That's a line from Staying Alive. So they called that the New World. And they had a treacherous, horrible crossing. Imagine it crossing the Atlantic Ocean. It lasted 2 months. They dropped anchor near the tip of Cape Cod, and then they crossed Massachusetts Bay, and then they established the village at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now, their first winter was brutal. Most of the colonists just stayed on the ship. They didn't get out. But they weren't getting any fresh fruits or vegetables, so they got scurvy. Scurvy, your whole body falls apart, no vitamin C. They had exposure. Imagine going through a Canadian winter with nobody to teach you how to stay warm, and contagious diseases that they brought with them. So only half of them were left over, less than 50 of them remained. And then they moved ashore, and then they got a visit from the Abenaki tribe, who showed up and knew English and said, "How y'all doing?" I don't think he said it with a Southern accent, but I'm adding a little poetic liberty. So he says, "You guys are going to die. I got to help you." Now, this is like heartrending. He goes back and he picks up Squanto. Now, Squanto is a member of another tribe, the Pawtuxet tribe. Now, Squanto had been kidnapped by an English sea captain, sold into slavery. He escaped to London, England, returned back to North America on an exploratory expedition. Talk about a life that he even wanted anything to do. But after all the slavery and that, he starts to take on a little bit of understanding. He could certainly speak the European language, English. So he started teaching the Pilgrims how to grow corn, how to make maple syrup, how to catch fish, and avoid poisonous plants. You tried catching a fish without a fishing rod. Tell me how that goes for you. Those of you that are true First Nations that have been taught by your grandparents and your parents how to fish will know that it takes a little bit of ingenuity to build weirs and other things you have to do. So just imagine the level of compassion that's going on, and also how not to get poison ivy and poison oak and not eat berries that'll kill you in 20 minutes. He helped them forge an alliance with the local tribe, the Wampanoag, and that lasted for about 50 years. And they actually, according to historical record, they kind of got along. Here's the problem. More settlers are coming. This is only the beginning, and more settlers bring rifles, and they bring military, and they bring some greedy you-know-whats along with them. And it ain't so cute anymore. Now, one thing you should know, there was an attempt at settling indigenous lands in about 1100 by the Vikings, led by Eric the Red. Eric the Red led Vikings to what he thought was a new land, and he met the various Micmacs and other people of the Nova Scotia. There was numbers of tribes from East Coast, probably that you know more about than I do. So they found the Vikings wandering around in the bush, starving, and they did the same thing. They said, "We'll help you out. Here, stay in our lodges. You're not going to survive like this." And then the Vikings began to do what Vikings do best: pillage, rape, war. They were nasty people. They were warlike, and they believed in taking what they wanted. So they started pulling that nonsense here, but they came up against First Nations warriors. And these First Nations warriors weren't French soldiers who they'd been terrorizing for 7 centuries. They've met an equal component that can fight just as well as a Viking. So then they made friends and went back and forth. And finally, after being jerked around for a long time, all the First Nations people from the Nova Scotia area said, "We've had it, you're out of here." They took thousands of them. They made an attack at the Viking party, and Eric the Red was shot through the heart with an arrow and died on the ship as they were hauling away. And the Vikings never returned to North America that we know, and got their, handed to them by indigenous warriors. So there's a story here that the First Nations people say, "We're going to help you out," and then the crap starts. And it's important to realize that part of Thanksgiving is real. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the soft end of it and get a little more radical as we go. In November 1621, after the first corn harvest works, yay, they can finally eat, because the First Nations said, "Here's how you grow corn." Now they got corn. So now there's a governor. Okay. So he organizes a big feast, and he said, "Hey, Chief Massasoit, come on, bring your people. Let's have a big feast. Let's celebrate." And so that was called America's first Thanksgiving, and it lasted for 3 days. And we know that there was a fellow named Edward Winslow who was a chronicler, and he wrote he described what they ate. There was no oven, there was no sugar. There was no pies, cakes, or desserts. This kind of stuff on the bottom of the screen is what you ate, because that's what they had. So it was a new way of, and of course, they're bringing lots of Protestant religion along with them, and things are going to about to get ugly. But we're still in early days, 1600s. We got no residential scoop yet. That comes later, but we are starting to see the seeds of colonization. Starts right here. Pilgrims held their second Thanksgiving celebration in 1623. There'd been a long drought and they nearly didn't eat that year. They were really happy and thankful to God for their food. So Governor Bradford calls for a religious fast. So you would fast during Thanksgiving. You wouldn't eat turkey. You would not eat at all. What the Jews do at Yom Kippur, they want to atone for their sins. It comes in November each year, October, and they don't eat. Muslims also have a different fasting that they do near Ramadan. The idea of denying yourself pleasure to give thanks to God. So this is going on. Now, during the American Revolution, the Continental Congress says we should have some Thanksgivings each year. So George Washington issues the first proclamation, and he says, Americans, let's be happy that we got rid of the British in the War of Independence, and we have a constitution. And John Adams and James Madison said, yes, we're going to. So presidents now started recognizing Thanksgiving. Now in 1817, New York becomes the first to offer an annual Thanksgiving holiday, New York City. And that's what New York looked like in those days. And the South wasn't aware of it. The Southern US and Northern US were very ideologically separated. The South still endorsed the slave trade. The North were abolitionists of slavery. But nonetheless, everybody needs a good social media influencer. And this is our first one. In 1827, Sarah Josepha Hale, pictured here, she invented the nursery rhyme, Mary had a little lamb, that's hers. She launched a campaign to say, hey, America, let's have a holiday. So for 36 years, she fought to create Thanksgiving. And finally, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln says, yeah, we want to ask God to commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the civil strife, and to heal the wounds of the nation. So can North and South unite again? Can we put the past behind us? And then, of course, we bring it to modern day, which is 1924. This is the first Thanksgiving Day Parade. And this is run by Macy's department store. And it's still one of the biggest parades in the world. About 3 million people come along, and it kind of looks like that. Well, that was the first parade. Now it looks better, of course. But this was a big celebration. Do you see the different narratives? We had the Pilgrims narrative is, I got to get away from the Catholics. They're going to burn me at the stake. And the Catholics were doing nasty stuff. They didn't just do nasty things. Catholics opened the first medical schools, the first universities. But Catholics also brought the Spanish Inquisition. One example of the persecution that you should know about was called the Inquisition. It lasted for 400 years, and it was just murdering Jews. There is an illogical, irrational hatred of Jews that went through all of Europe. And I like to compare First Nations people with the Jews because neither of you had any love from any country. The Jews were homeless for 2,000 years. There is this idea that you get a homeland and you get excited and you're looking for a homeland. So that's something we begin to understand a little bit about how these holidays celebrate. But they were escaping and what the church did to the conversos, these were Jews who had converted to Catholicism, because a regular Jew could not be punished under law. They had law that protected them. Those were started by Poland in about 1000 AD. But the Jews that said, it's okay, I'll become a Christian because I get benefits by being seen as one of you. Well, for 400 years, they tortured them with things. If I talk about them, you will not be able to unhear them. The most hideous torture devices you can imagine. So you could imagine when the Pilgrims came to the new country, they were escaping that. They weren't coming to conquer First Nations people. They didn't even know they were here. So you see how your narrative, the way you see the world, changes history, doesn't it? So we don't really know, in conclusion, whether that was really the first Thanksgiving, of course. In 1565, this fellow at the bottom of the screen, Pedro Menendez de Avila, he invited a local tribe in Florida to hold a mass to thank God because his crew didn't die at sea. on December 4th, 1619, 38 British settlers reached another site called Berkeley 100 near the Virginia. And they said, this is the way, thank you, God. So they were basically getting on the imagine going across the Atlantic Ocean in a single ship. When you got to shore, you thanked God. You said, Christ, I didn't die. So the problem is, that's a nice story, but the story goes on. Now, there is evidence that the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all did the same thing. There was a Jewish harvest festival called Sukkot. That's what you're looking at the bottom. It's you lay out a table and tents outside and you give thanks for the harvest to God. So, I mean, all of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman culture had it. I don't know if you know it, but even a Christmas came from the Romans, and that we would maybe do in a separate talk closer to Christmas. It actually was a feast called Saturnalia. So, and also we know that the First Nations people, which are called Native now in the US and called Indigenous in Canada, there's various things we call to show respect. We're using First Nations for now. It seems to hit in this story the proper term anyhow. So they were holding parties anyhow. Hi, it's the harvest. Let's have a party. But they weren't letting anything turn into liquor. They were throwing that away. Europeans were letting it ferment. And I can't tell you the horror that inflicts later on. So now I want to use a number of visuals to start to switch this to a new narrative from a First Nations perspective. And now let's be more granular. Happy Thanksgiving. Indian land has been captured, and within 30 days, you can have a homestead. Look at that, $7 an acre in Colorado. They did not ask for it politely. And then this, Andrew Jackson had them hunting children. Because of polygeneity, there were animals and could be hunted. There is no boundaries to the ignorance of the human mind. The Spanish encountering Floridian indigenous people. And to be honest, the indigenous people in Florida didn't fool around. They burned. They did it in Texas too. They burned their forts. They said, we don't want you here. And then as they moved into the South, there was the Comanche and the Apache. The Comanche had displaced the Apache. The Comanche were some of the best warriors. Their command of the use of the horse, they could fire 3 arrows in a second. But they were eventually colonized and wiped out. And they weren't people to mess around with. So we begin to see this horrific history start to ensue after Plymouth. What was interesting as a break from the tragedy was that these were matrilineal systems. And many of you who are First Nations know this better than I do. But this is true. It's been like confirmed archaeologically, anthropologically. So basically they were matrifocal. When a young couple would marry, you would live with the woman's family, not the man's. The women controlled all the property. The hereditary status was passed. It's in Judaism. If your mom is Jewish, you're a Jew. If your dad is Jewish, it doesn't matter. It's what your mom is. And the same thing here. Whether you're really a member of the tribe had to do with this transmission. Men were in political roles to relate with other tribes, but women passed plots of land to female descendants, so they control the lands. And there is a Lakota Sioux prophecy I've been made aware of where this is actually figuring into present times, where indigenous women need to rise up, take control of business. And that's the only way to save us from climate change and what they call the white man's gun. Now, the early contacts had occurred all through history. Even in 1614, Captain Thomas Hunt captured several of them and sold them in Spain as slaves. So the slavery trade is starting here with First Nations people. And I don't think most people know. And this guy Squanto, who had been captured by Spanish monks, remember, he's the one that helped the settlers. He was captured, turned into a slave. Eventually they set him free, but they wanted to convert him first. And then he went to Newfoundland as an interpreter, and he found out his whole tribe was dead from the epidemic we talked about that probably came from the French, leptospirosis, and that he helped. Despite all that, he still helped them. I don't think people understand the degree of which we were welcomed. The epidemic we talked about was 1616 to 1619. It wasn't smallpox. In 2010, we've learned it was called the 7-day fever, and we believe that it might have to do with an epidemic transmitted through the soil. And this was in people that had traded a lot with the French, so it suggests that this was another gift of Europe to the First Nations people. 90% of tribes, some of them were lost with this epidemic. It killed you in a week. The Black Plague killed you in 24 hours. COVID, without a vaccine and medication, 72 hours. One of my family members died of COVID. It took 2 days. You got from healthy to gone. So when these gotcha epidemics, they got you, and we didn't have vaccines then. So here's another part of the story. We're going to start to move toward the end of our presentation here. After 1650, someone named John Eliot, he was a member of the Puritan missionaries. They wanted to convert all of the First Nations people to Christianity. So they converted, and when they were converted, they called them praying towns. So now you were a First Nations person who had a crucifix and you lived in a praying town. And you would hope that you would start monogamy. Again, marriage was different across Indigenous cultures. I've studied Indigenous cultures around the world. I worked for the WHO and the UN for many years, and I have a lot of interest in Indigenous views of health, mysticism, faith. It's really unusual to have a man and a wife and kids. It's usually the whole group taking care of the children, or you have a place like Tanzania where a man may have 6 or 7 wives and each has their own hut and had the children they bore with that wife. But this whole idea of to death do us part is a pretty Christian thing. Agriculture and jurisprudence. Well, agriculture was larger agriculture, monocropping, all the bad stuff. And jurisprudence was following European law. There was Indigenous law, and, the rules might have been different. So the idea is convert, convert, convert. And a lot of the epidemics worked because they were losing massive numbers of people. And the First Nations people were in a spiritual crisis because they had medicine people and elders and religious leaders, and yet the epidemics were tearing through and killing them. So they said, like the Jews said to God in 1939, when the Nazis began to put them in death camps, "Wherefore art thou, Lord? I thought we were special. Well, all my prayers go unanswered. You're murdering my people." And that was what was going on here. So because they stopped believing in their own elders, they begin to turn to the church. They say, well, maybe the Christians know something we don't, because they don't seem to be dying the same way we are. The Christians did have some idea of medicine, basic science, but there were deaths on both sides. But you see what happens, how it cascades. Hell, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and horrible things happen because various factors converge. So now you have different regions with Indian conversions. They called them praying towns. They had to follow colonial laws, colonial manners. They had to look like colonial. They had to wear ties and suits and whatever the heck they wanted them to wear. They had to cut their hair. And the ministers said, those that conform, we love you. But they didn't punish anyone that didn't go along with it. They just said, don't worry, we're not going to hurt you, but really you got to follow Jesus. That's the way to do it. So the Christian Indian settlements develop, which have crucifixes, but they also have traditional First Nation beliefs and teachings of the 7 grandfathers, whatever else you might look at. They coexisted together. And they would often just dress as First Nations people, live that way. They didn't have to go to church. So they tried to live together to find some peace, which was short-lived because of the sheer number of colonists that invade. So we're just going to finish on the note of my face. This is David Chandross from Toronto Metropolitan University, talking about Thanksgiving and how different narratives affect the story. So I'm not sure that I can ever say Happy Thanksgiving again. To me, it is the birth of a horrific tragedy, and maybe we need an entirely new name for the holiday. And I think we'd look to our First Nations people for a little guidance on what we might call that process of thanks. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.